Alrighty, we have made it to the final biopsych section. So make sure that you are still following along with that activity and should be able to finish up the last part of that while watching this video. And yeah, we'll be talking about neurotransmitters and well, actually, really just one neurotransmitter. We're going to just focus on dopamine. So definitely getting won't be giving a full in-depth talk here about neurotransmitters in general, but dopamine itself is very important for motivation. And then we will end with certain brain structures that also play very large roles in motivation. So, as I mentioned, starting with dopamine here, you can see these are just this is the chemical signature for dopamine itself, and this is the chemical signature for something called L-DOPA. So dopamine, what it does is a precursor to adrenaline and noradrenaline. So from the last couple of videos, we know that these two hormones play roles in stress and how we respond to stress. And so therefore dopamine also is relevant to stress response processes. It also supports conditioning amongst quite a few other things, but what I mean by supports conditioning is basically it just has a pretty large role in learning and learning about what happens with certain rewards or punishments, or what happens when we do certain behaviors, what can we expect, whether or not we can expect a reward after that. Yeah. And so I'm not going to watch this during the lecture, but please afterwards or right now, you can pause this video and go watch this. It's a pretty long video. Definitely don't, unless you're really interested in it. But for the purposes of this lecture, you don't have to watch the whole video. Started at about 25.5 minutes, and then go to about the 42-minute, 45-second mark, unless you want to keep watching. Basically, just broad overview of what you'll be seeing is the behaviors, various behaviors such as social behaviors and feeding behaviors of dopamine deficient mice. And then you also see what happens when those mice are given some L-DOPA, which is a treatment for that dopamine deficiency. And so, yeah, basically you'll just see that these mice are really, the dopamine deficient ones are really just apathetic and unmotivated. And yeah, the L-DOPA definitely helps with that. L-DOPA itself, I think, is probably most well known for its role, historic role in Parkinson's treatment. So continuing on with dopamine here. So as you'll see in that video, dopamine is very, very important for starting goal-directed behavior. And that is obviously quite a large piece of motivation, is being motivated to go pursue certain goals, whatever those goals are. And so that lack of dopamine that you see in the mice in the video, and that also when this happens in humans, this is often associated with a lack of motivation and apathy. And so I mentioned on the last slide that it plays a role in conditioning and learning as well. So response increases after conditioned stimulus in anticipation of reward, and decreases when no reward occurs. That's just what we're seeing over here. And this shows the how learning and motivation tie in together. And so in this chart here, this is just recordings of certain dopamine cells that fire in response to a reward. So you can see there's no conditioned stimulus here, and around the reward, you can see that these cells are really firing. Here, after a few trials and learning for this conditioned stimulus and what can be expected with the conditioned stimulus, I believe this study was with monkeys, and so the reward, sorry, should have mentioned that, the R here is just reward, conditioned stimulus, and so the reward is juice, and the conditioned stimulus, I believe, is a noise. So then they learned that when they hear this noise, they can expect that reward. So then those dopamine cells that are getting excited about this reward start firing at the conditioned stimulus. And then in this condition, you can see that still occurs here with the firing for the conditioned stimulus, but then there's the inhibition of these cells firing when no reward occurs. And so that just shows that dopamine itself also plays a role in unlearning. So kind of relearning that, okay, maybe that reward is not going to show up after this conditioned stimulus. So yeah, dopamine's its two main roles in motivation, therefore, are to signal a reward, as well as being the mechanism by which conditioning or this form of learning is occurring. Playing a very large role in amygdala, especially really quick, kind of more of an emotional motivation, is the amygdala here, the two, I guess, acorn-looking things. And so, yeah, the amygdala is associated with the primary emotional response, so it's really quick. Basically, what it does is the amygdala, along with other parts in the temporal lobe, categorize stimuli into what they are and what we've learned to know what these things are. And the amygdala specifically then categorizes these things into good or bad, which, as you can imagine, is then associated with some sort of an emotional response. And so this plays a role in stress processes, and again is more of a primary or early trigger for stress responses. When the amygdala is damaged, you can imagine that there are quite a few issues that occur here, because that initial stress or fear response that not always, but for the most part is adaptive, then that doesn't occur anymore. So then there's problems when, if the amygdala are damaged and the individual is out walking around, maybe that individual then doesn't know to be fearful of cars when crossing the street, or be fearful of, predators, such as bears or whatever, when on a hike, whatever that might be, which creates some very dangerous situations. And this occurs because the damaged amygdala often leads to something called psychic blindness, which is basically where these individuals still see whatever the object or whatever the thing is, that's still processed in the occipital lobe and all of that, but what's seen can't be categorized. And so that's where you get that lack of emotional response, with the lack of being able to categorize whatever that is into good or bad. And the damaged amygdala is also associated with impaired emotional memories. So just not being able to remember that, hey, I've seen that before, and that led to something bad. I should remember that so it doesn't happen again. Oftentimes those types of memories are impaired. And it's also involved in the incentive motivation system. So the learning of adaptive responses, that's pretty much on the same lines of what I just said, in terms of being able to learn and remember that, though this behavior is going to lead to this reward, or this behavior has turned out bad, I probably shouldn't do that. Moving on to the lateral prefrontal, sorry, I'll change that, it should be cortex. And so that's just right here, getting pretty close to the frontmost part of the brain, and lateral just means kind of on the sides of the brain as opposed to towards the middle. And so this part of the brain, I mean, the prefrontal cortex in general is thought of as kind of just the control area, it's an area of the brain that lots of animals don't have, but we as humans have evolved to have, and it's a way for us to control some initial impulses. And so this area specifically is involved with motivation regulation and override, otherwise basically known as self-control. Has a large role in things like planning and working memory. And this is one of the latest developing regions. So takes quite a few years for this region of the brain to fully develop, and this along with some other prefrontal places such as the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. The later development of these areas is why younger individuals such as preteens are often associated with making more risky decisions, just because these control areas are not fully developed yet. And so, as I just mentioned, there's also the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. It's in a similar location. The lateral is just right about here. And neuro language, dorso just is up. Ventral would be down. Yeah, and so this area is associated with a lot of similar things as low lateral prefrontal cortex, like executive control, goal maintenance, which is very similar to the just self-control, which is needed for goal maintenance. Goal maintenance is just, the continuation of recognizing where you are in terms of reaching that goal and keeping yourself motivated over the long term towards reaching that goal. So keeping yourself, going to the gym a few days a week, whatever that might be, and inhibiting certain responses such as those initial wants or those more short-term goals, like maybe going and drinking or smoking cigarettes, or eating some dessert or whatever that might be. This area is known for inhibiting those types of responses, and also plays a large role in things like risky decisions, which the lateral prefrontal cortex has a role in that as well. And this also plays a part in whether we approach or avoid certain objects in the environment or whatever that might be. So speaking of approach versus avoidance, there seems to be, this isn't too well understood at this point in time, but there does seem to be differences in the hemispheres in terms of deciphering approach motivations versus avoidance motivations. And so the left side is associated with being more of an approach system versus the right hemisphere associated with being more of an avoidance system. And so approach includes things like moving towards a stimulus. Oftentimes when we approach things, that's reward, but this can also look like the fight behaviors and fight or flight scenarios. Additionally, or on the right hemisphere now, the avoidance area, this is associated with things like moving away from a stimulus. Oftentimes that stimulus is punishment because we want to avoid that, but can also be associated with the flight and fight or flight scenarios. And there's also this abstraction gradient part that you can see here, as well as here. And basically that's just pointing out that typically as we get more towards the front of this frontal cortex, that's going to be a more abstract, some more hypothetical thinking, planning, things like that, versus once you get back towards the motor cortex here, that's going to be more along the lines of specific behaviors and movements. And so all of this, the approach versus avoidance being different based on the hemispheres. It's just called asymmetric frontal cortical activity. The last area that I want to cover here is the orbitofrontal cortex. And so we can see that right here towards the bottom of the frontal cortex. And so a main role of this area is encoding for reward contingencies, and the lateral part of the orbitofrontal cortex is associated with encoding more punishment contingencies versus the medial, or more towards the middle versus lateral on the sides. So the medial orbitofrontal cortex is associated with more encoding for reward. And the combination of all this, what this area is maybe most well known for, is just affective learning. So taking various emotions, whether they be positive associated with reward or negative associated with punishment, and using those emotions in learning and memory of learning. And so that's it. That's the end of the biopsych section. Next, we'll be getting into more arousal type of discussions and topics. So make sure that you have completed that activity, and hopefully you followed along. You can wrap that up pretty quickly, and go ahead and submit that.